You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is December 28th, 2023 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I have been actually in bed with a bad cold for the last couple of weeks. Well, 10 days. I'm the kind of patient who likes to exaggerate symptoms. And I have a lingering cough, which may make it impossible to actually give much of a talk. So I will give it a go. And if I end up not being able to do it, we're just going to do a little bit longer meditation. How's that as a plan? It's the last talk of this year. And I was thinking about this. If you made an intention for what to do next year, I think that I would make a pitch for a really strong emphasis on authenticity as your intention. And one of the things about authenticity is that the origin of the capacity to be able to do that in an effortless way that feels safe comes from that very early attachment conditioning, where you're able to express yourself, and essentially you have sensitive enough caregivers who pay attention to those expressions, try to understand them, mirror them back to you so that you can understand what it is that you're expressing. This is in the very earliest part of life, and then do their best to meet your needs in a way that's useful to you, which creates this cycle of the authentic expression of what your needs are, the expectation that they'll be received and responded to in a sensitive and caring way, and that actually the needs that you express will be met to the best of the person's ability to do that. Seems pretty straightforward. Christian?
George, when you talk about authenticity, I assume that you're talking about in terms of like one-on-one relationships. But is that the kind of the gist of it, or do you extend that out to all facets of life? Because I think authenticity was like one of the Merriam-Webster words of the year or something like that. So it's getting thrown out around a lot as sort of a buzzword, which can dilute it sometimes, in my opinion.
Yeah. Interesting. I saw a Trevor Noah comedy thing, and he actually talked about attachment strategies, and so that's also coming into the fore of the cultural conversation, which I think is a good thing, as long as it has the depth to it that's needed. What I mean by authenticity is that you're able to express, in accordance with the intimacy level that the relationship is with the other person, your experience of the present moment in a way that communicates completely what it is that you're experiencing in the exchange with the other person. Is that making sense? Now, of course, this does not mean that you tell everyone everything. This means that you moderate the way that you express it so it matches the terms of your relationship as it is, as it's negotiated. So that if we use Dunbar's frame, people above the line, people that you're intimate with, that have an expectation that you'll tell them what's actually happening with you, that you do give them a complete representation of your experience of the present moment. and that people who are below the line, who have not demonstrated the level of trust and reliability that would warrant that level of expression, you reserve the complete expression to what's appropriate with the relationship. Right? Is that making sense? And one of the ways that we can tell that that's happening is if we share something and then we feel a vulnerability that we could be in danger in some way. That would mean that you're sharing beyond the context of the relationship that you've established with the person. And so we need to be sensitive to that. And it really is on us to regulate that level of sharing. Now, you may have an experience of somebody where you want to add a little bit of trust to see how they do with it. And that's really how you develop over time an intimate relationship. You give somebody the opportunity to be reliable and trustworthy and then see how they do. And if they're reliable and trustworthy, then you can give them a little bit more and it tends to build up. One of the things with insecure attachment or disorganized attachment is a tendency to, overshare in a big way and then feel at risk in the relationship, which leads in some ways to this showing up and pulling back that's very common in insecure and disorganized relationships. Particularly fearfully avoidant people tend to show up, overshare, and then retreat because they're frightened by the expression. But if you can think about that cycle of you offer somebody the opportunity to demonstrate their reliability and their trustworthiness, and if they do well with that, then you offer them a little bit more, and then it builds up. You have a good idea of what the terms of the relationship are and keep your expressions within that boundary. So if this is, of course, personal relationships as well as work relationships, that you understand what the context of the work relationship is, and then you divulge an appropriate expression that it meets the terms of those relationships so that you don't get a kind of boundaryless merging of personal and work relationships. This, of course, requires mentalizing, that you have to be able to mentalize fast enough to be able to track all of this stuff as it's happening in the present moment. With the reduction of mentalizing that is typically associated with insecure and disorganized people, one of the reasons that they have a hard time moderating what's appropriate to share and what isn't appropriate to share is because they can't mentalize fast enough to make those discernments before the expression. Is that making sense? Christian?
George, I don't know if you like the mentalizing model where it's like a bunch of sort of discrete skills, but what would you think would be the skill that the person that you just described would need to kind of get over that hump of like what they would need to see in order to not overshare? Yeah.
So the way that I think about it is that you're clear about what it is that you want to express. That's the first part of the mentalizing cycle. Then the second part of the mentalizing cycle is you're familiar or not with the person that you're going to share it to. You understand how they tend to think of things, and so some representation of their mind in your mind, so that you can then formulate the way that you're going to communicate it to them in a way that they're likely to understand what you're saying. So you're understanding first what it is that you want to communicate, and then you're formulating in a way that's meant to be communicative specifically to the person that you're sharing it with. Then you hang out there and pay attention to their reaction to what you're expressing. You want to make sure that they understand what you meant so that you're paying attention to their reaction. you're taking in their reaction, and that informs you about the process of communication. Either they understood what you had in mind and react to it in a way that's different than you thought, or adds information to your understanding, or you're aware that they haven't understood what you meant, and then you reformulate it so that you can express it in a way that does create this cycle of communication. But those four pieces, you know what you want to communicate, you understand how to communicate it to be communicative to the person you're trying to relay something to, you track their reaction to what it is that you've expressed, and that modifies your next exchange. Making sense? And where that can break down, the most common way that that breaks down is you don't track their response. So you make an expression for what it is that you want, and if you don't get what you want, you just reformulate, ask, and repeat it. That's a very typical way that non-mentalizing conversations go. If you don't have that early experience of just being free to express your needs and having a sensitive enough caregiver understand what they are, reflect them back to you, and then attempt to meet the needs, then you begrudgingly learn inauthenticity. And for most, infants and small children where this process happens, it's a very painful process to have to do that. And what you learn instead, depending on the conditioning, of course, dismissing people who grow up to be dismissing adults often have the experience of childhood where they're not permitted to express anything that isn't on the good side, on the ideal side of things. So any difficulty that they're having, any emotional difficulties, any difficulties with things that they need to do is not expressed or translated into an idealizing way of expression. They're neglected, and so they don't expect a responsiveness from the caregiver. They know that in order to get a response from the caregiver, it has to be presented in an ideal way, which they do, and they learn to do it. And they also learn that that's the currency of relationship. And anything that isn't that, they don't express. So that often what that results in is a internal experience where authentic expression and authentic desire and authentic exploration is a secret, which they don't willingly express too much. And then everything is offered in these very idealized way. Not because they know something different than that. They really do think, because of their experience, that that is the currency of relationships. And they think that they're good at it, good at being in relationship, because that's how relationships function. So they're over monitoring, and everything is rehearsed and presented. In people who grow up to be preoccupied, they don't monitor that much because of the inconsistency of the care that they receive. In a secure setup, you make an expression and you get a predictable response from it. That's the thing that makes it secure. You make the expression and you get the care. Make the expression, then you get the care. In somebody who grows up to be dismissing, everything has to be idealized, and so everything is translated into that way of expression. But in a preoccupied adult's childhood, the care is so unpredictable that you could do the same thing 3 times and get 3 completely different responses for it. So there's no need to track it. There's just a need to generate iterations of asking so that you can get what you need in that situation. So there's a kind of relentlessness to it. And that's very typical of what you want, how to express it. I'm going to try this. Not much attention to the reaction because that doesn't really matter. And then did you get it or not? And then just re-upping again. So if you're, what this creates, of course, is what we call the non-mentalizing mode of pretend. So pretend mode. You pretend to be what you think the other person wants you to be so that you can get your needs met from them. And it isn't that you know something different than that. That's how you think the currency of relationships operate. So the inauthentic piece, we often think that people are volitional in doing this and that they have alternatives that they're not using, but they could use. We often demand of them that they just switch into authenticity or they just switch to seeing clearly what they're doing and stop doing it, which is really an unrealistic ask because they don't have the alternative skill and they don't have the mentalizing to recognize an alternative to what they're doing. They think, and the reason they think that is because that has been their experience, that what they're doing is how relationships work. And so there's a process of learning the different skill set to be able to be authentic. So if you're not so far down the rabbit hole of pretend mode that you still can recognize what your authentic response is to the present moment, and you move to express that, what that tends to do is intensify the abandonment anxiety. The child's experience is if I don't perform in the way that my caregivers demand of me, I will be abandoned. And, children can't survive without an adult caring for them. So it creates a very intense experience. Know what the authentic thing is, but if I express it, I'll be abandoned. So the abandonment terror arises. The abandonment terror arises. Then the inauthentic thing you could say instead arises in the mind. And where the delusion is that because the inauthentic thing relieves the abandonment terror, you think that it's helpful to the relationship. But actually, it's undermining the relationship. And a little while later, if you do push into the expression of the inauthentic thing, you'll be angry because you're not actually getting what you want. There's an underlying, ongoing anxiety that happens because you're constantly afraid that if they find out what the authentic thing is, whatever agreement you made won't hold and you'll be back into the abandonment experience. And if you ask for things that you don't genuinely want, even if they meet that, your authentic needs are not being met. So that's the cycle. If you push into the authentic expression, the abandonment terror intensifies. And if you can hold that experience, it does dissolve eventually, but then you're sideswiped by this wave of terrible sadness. You've probably heard me say this a million times. The terrible sadness, and depending on what your conditioning is, it takes on different forms. At the core of the terrible sadness for somebody who's dismissing is the belief that there's nothing that you can do to get people to take care of you, to be responsive to you. At the core of the terrible sadness for preoccupied people is the understanding that You were the one that abandoned yourself long after the need to do that was over. So when we get, in childhood, we make all of these adaptations to live in the family system that we were given into. And then when we hit puberty and our cognitive mind takes on this capacity to really see more clearly, the epistemic trust can shatter. So epistemic trust means that you believe that the person is telling you the truth, and you believe that the reason that what they're telling you is to be helpful to you, which means that you can learn from them. This is that fundamental piece. And that if you don't believe that they're telling you the truth, or you believe that they're telling you what they're telling you to serve their interest against your interest, then it breaks and you can't learn from them. To be in adult relationships that are intimate and open, that this epistemic trust needs to be intact so that you have the capacity to share experiences with each other. I like to say that intimate relationships, the relationships that you surround yourself with, are there to support your primary exploration, which is you finding meaning in the things that you spend your time doing. And one of the aspects of that is that you can express to somebody in an intimate way what it is that you're finding out and what it is that means to you. The advantage for the other person, of course, is that they can learn from your exploration and all of the things that you're discovering, so they don't have to go do it for themselves. And then in that collaborative exchange, you express to them what you're finding out, and they can learn from you. And so they don't have to do, so that you don't have to do what they're doing. Hopefully I got that balanced. But if your epistemic trust is broken, then you don't take in that information from other people. One of the things that happens when it really gets broken is that you turn away from adults and into your peer group. But as you get older, of course, that rejection of what your elders, if we can use a obsolete term, might provide for you in terms of cycles of growth. One of the things about the human condition, I don't know if you've noticed it, is that we learn basically everything over. There's no general transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. And most of the learning that we do is cultural. So everything is cloaked in cultural values, and that's what we learn, how that transmission of information happens, which is very good. None of us really had to figure out how to make a wheel because of the cultural transmission of wheels. None of us had to figure out how to light a fire because that came with the cultural transmission. And if you had caregivers who were attentive to your development as a child and filled you in on all of this, then you have an understanding of that. But what also comes with that is the idea of what a man is, a woman is, and who's deserving and who isn't deserving. And it comes in so early. It's very hard to have any kind of perspective about what the nature of the cultural conditioning is, what those biases are that are implanted. And it isn't simply in evaluation of other people that we do this, but we also use that cultural rubric to evaluate ourselves. where we stand in this hierarchy. So one of the things I, from the Buddhist frame, talk about is a sense of the enjoyment of your beingness, that you are a conditioned being. And through no fault of your own, you have been royally conditioned from the very beginning. And one way to look at that is a curiosity about what happened and what you took in. And so from that conscious self-experience with this open, curious, kind, delighting response to yourself, discover what that is. In some sense, the conscious self-experience is your capacity to look at yourself, do the things that you do, since you don't really make the decisions about what you're going to do from the conscious self-experience. It's really meant to observe what decisions you've made and to have a chance of intervention if you're doing something that might not be skillful. But we can easily get into these jags of negativity or criticism around ourselves, which really comes from that cultural framework and from that response that we got as infants to the expression of our ordinary needs. Did you luck out and did you have a caregiver that was able and resourced enough to respond to you sensitively and then meet the needs reliably so that you feel a sense of safety in the world? Or did you have a caregiver who was overburdened, and so those ordinary needs that you expressed were mirrored back to you as extraordinary, as too demanding, too difficult, too unwanted? That you begin to understand that the expression of your ordinary needs are that, instead of something ordinary that somebody would be delighted to help with. So in this movement from inauthentic to authentic, we really are mentalizing this process of what is my authentic experience of what's happening in the present moment. And this is that internal self-oriented experience through this open, curious, delighting response, no matter what the response is, right? And then understanding how that might be expressed, and does that create abandonment terror? And if it does, you'll notice the mind coming up with the inauthentic response that you use to regulate the abandonment terror. This is that active mentalizing. And then moving yourself more into the authentic expression, keeping in mind the level of intimacy that you have and what the agreement is in the relationships that you have. One way to tell if you're used to inauthenticity is that when you make the authentic expression, you're frightened. Sorry, if you make the authentic expression, the abandonment terror peaks. And if you make the inauthentic expression, it doesn't. That's one way to tell the difference if you have difficulty with that. But you do it 1 time, 3 times, 10 times, 100 times, and then it disarms that abandonment here, and then you can be effortlessly authentic in that way. You have to, unfortunately, do each situation. But the more you push into authenticity, the less reactive the abandonment terror is. And you move more and more into that. You may notice that you can't do it and that you express the inauthentic thing, but then you want to repair it as fast as possible. You have to be skillful in doing it. One of the things that happens and is often unrecoverable in relationships is if you've been successful in inauthentic expressions to someone, they haven't understood that they're not inauthentic. When you wait too long to correct them, or you correct them in a way that frightens or breaks the epistemic trust of the other person, it's very hard to repair it. People are skillful at being inauthentic when you want to backtrack against it. It's better to acknowledge that you did express that, but that you've thought about it and you've changed your mind about it, rather than to say, I lied, and this is actually how I feel. Is that making sense? The purpose of that is to preserve the epistemic trust in the other person. Because if you confront somebody with the fact that you can lie to them and that they can't tell the difference, they won't believe anything you say after a while, because they can't discern one from the other. So when you're moving into authenticity, it's better to manage that than it is to break the epistemic trust. Because even though you're coming into a place of being authentic, if you break the epistemic trust, the other person won't be able to recover from that. Is that making sense? So one of the difficulties of coming out of pretend mode or coming out of inauthenticity is that the way that you manage it. It's to acknowledge that you did say that and that but you're changing your mind is very different than saying, I didn't mean that. I just didn't want to say what I really thought. Is that making sense? There's no big moment of truth where you throw up the cloak of inauthenticity and then show yourself so that you'll be loved where the other person doesn't go. Put the cloak back on. That's what I really wanted. When you put out an inauthenticity, you draw people that want the inauthenticity. And then when you decide that you can't do the inauthenticity anymore and want to be authentic, you have to renegotiate all those relationships because they're based on the inauthenticity, not on the authenticity. Christian?
Do you think that a level of inauthenticity can be sustained in relationship with a secure person? Like you've described it as like a secure person will feel very bewildered if it's suddenly revealed that the person they're in relationship with has been lying maybe about something big the whole time. But I wonder why that could go on for so long.
Well, secure people are really the ones that don't recover from the discovery of the inauthenticity, or at least the least able to. And the reason for that is that they've always been able to get their needs met by expressing themselves authentically. So they don't see a need for anything else. And they also can't do it. They're not good at detecting lies. They're not good at lying. And so when they recognize that they can't tell whether you're telling them the truth or not, the security of the relationship is gone. And they need that simplicity. What you'll notice in dismissing people when they're called out, they'll agree to everything. And they'll even do it for a while. But as soon as they think it's back to normal, all of that's gone. And they're just back to the way that it was. And they think the relationship has gone back to the way. But preoccupied people don't monitor that. They really don't monitor whether somebody does what they say they're going to do, or they don't do what they say they're not going to do. That's why it takes them so long. So that in an insecure dynamic, say between a dismissing and a preoccupied person, as long as the preoccupied person has the proximity they need, they're not really tracking until they get so burnt out that they can't do it anymore. But that has more to do with they're doing all of the caretaking of the other person, and the other person isn't reciprocating. And so they go along as long as they can, and then when they burn out, they can't do it anymore. And then they make the demands, and they expect the dismissing person to suddenly become responsive, but they don't. You know, you make your demand and you huff off and you expect them to chase you down, but they often don't. And then you move into an agreement with somebody else where you're not tracking whether they do what they say they're going to do.
I guess I'm wondering though, because you were just describing before that, by being inauthentic, you will the people that'll be attracted to that are the people that like inauthenticity, that want you to be inauthentic. But then in the cases where
Not exactly.
Okay.
You present something that's inauthentic and they want what you presented. They don't want you to be inauthentic. They want what you presented.
Okay.
They think that what you're presenting is authentic. That's what they want.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that clarifies then.
So for us that learned inauthenticity in childhood, the urge, my urging is for you to begin to really mentalize that moment when you know authentically what it is that your response is to the present moment, and then make that the basis of your communication intention. Figure out how you're going to communicate it so that it's within the agreed intimacy level with the person, and then make the expression, and then track how it lands so that you can take that reaction information in and that cycle of changing your mind about things or understanding something more deeply, so that that can then inform the next cycle of expression. You will notice that if you are used to being inauthentic, that the authentic expression will create that abandonment terror. And that if you are able to get through that, you will be hit with sadness, depending on what your attachment conditioning is. And if you can ride through that, that's when you come into the place of security, where you feel safe in being authentic in the expression. And if you do it enough around each little thing, then the authentic expression is effortless. Disorganized people, of course, are on the other side of the trauma line, so it's much more intense for them, because they don't fear abandonment so much as they fear real harm, And so you have to be careful. That's really where you're monitoring what is the level of intimacy that's appropriate in this relationship, so that you're not oversharing, which is the tendency of disorganized people, to put themselves at risk because they can't hold the abandonment experience. If you do this, the more you do it, of course, the less that general anxiety of living will be present, and you'll fall more and more into a sense of safety, into a sense of security, which makes it totally worth doing, even though the difficulty of going through that abandonment expression and that sadness expression. Is that all making sense? Little by little, in each moment, actively mentalizing, this is my real response to that. This is how I'm going to communicate it. This is the reaction to my communication. You don't worry about being discovered or called out, because you've presented what your experience is, and really step into that sense of the conscious self experience in that kind, open meta mind around watching yourself. Not in that critical, self-conscious way, but in that open, delighted way of how you respond to things. Because that whole process of conditioning is then revealed to yourself. That's how you know yourself, what it is that really makes you tick. What do you say we do some loving kindness practice for self?
Yes.
We'll start with an easy person. So go ahead and settle in. All right, let go of the meditation. So we have the fourth day of the current level 1, which is on Saturday. And then in January, we're starting a new level 2 on Fridays in the morning, if that's better for some people's schedules. It looks like I will be doing a 2-week retreat in Poland in May, and then maybe a week-long retreat in Utrecht in the beginning of June. That's what's coming up. The end of the year. So thanks everybody for your practice. It's been a real treat to sit with you. And I hope you enjoy it as we move into another cycle. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope if you can make a donation, you will. There's a link on the website to do that. Any amount is appreciated. And I will see you in the new year.
Thank you, George.
Bye.
Thank you, George.